Looks great.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to try to get through this pretty fast. My name is Joe Maroney. I'm Director of Fisheries and Water Resources for the Kalispel Tribe of Indians. I also sit on the Washington Invasive Species Council, and I'm going to talk today about non-native invasive species and their impact specifically on fisheries. So there's always kind of what term to use, and lots of terminology gets thrown out there as far as introduced, non-native, alien, exotic, non-indigenous. And these terms are kind of used interchangeably. And basically what it boils down to is species that occur outside of their historic range. So I know that there's a lot of terminology that's thrown out there, kind of depending upon where you're from. But the one that I really like to specifically use is non-native invasive species. And I'm going to kind of describe, why I kind of chose this particular one. And I apologize for this really lengthy words that are on this slide. And I'm not going to have any that have this many words. They're just going to have nice, pretty pictures. But this is a definition. I know that Blaine Parker was talking a little bit earlier about some specific definitions. And when I was doing some research several years ago, I came across this, and this was in California's Aquatic Invasive Species Management Plan. And basically it says it's a species that establish and reproduce rapidly outside their native range and may threaten the diversity and abundance of native species through competition for resources and predation. And then it kind of continues on. The interesting thing I really like, particularly about this definition of it, is it has to do with the words competition and also predation. So you don't really see that in several other definitions that are kind of used throughout this invasive world. So, and basically an invasive species is primarily by definition non-native, but not all non-native species are invasive. An example of that would be like kokanee. In Lake Pend Oreille, and I know that there's kokanee populations that are kind of spread throughout the Columbia Basin, whether it be in Dvorak or Lake Billy Chinook, other areas where they're not native, but they're not technically invasive. In fact, those fish might be actually contributing towards native species. And in fact, in the biological opinion for bull trout, which are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, kokanee is identified as a valuable food source for bull trout. And I don't know if Blaine Parker is still on, but occasionally native species can be invasive, particularly in a stress or an altered ecosystem. And the one example of that would be northern pike minnow. They're native fish, but because of the hydropower system, the numbers are exponentially higher than what they would be prior to hydropower development. In non-native invasive species, they also have specific traits that allow them to outcompete native species. And this is really kind of what gives them an advantage. A lot of these traits, and it's kind of spread whether you're dealing with fish or animals or plants, is they have fast growth, they rapidly reproduce, and they have a tolerance that is wide ranging of their environmental conditions. So particularly with northern pike, you have a fish that's classified as a cool water fish. So it can occupy habitats not only in cold water, but can also occupy habitats in warm water as well. So those kind of advantages give it a distinct advantage over, particularly native fish. And what are the mechanisms by which non-native fish, they impact native fish? Primarily has to do with competition, predation, disease, and also hybridization. And the impact of invasive species is, and this is kind of on a more of a US lower 48 and Alaska scale, is there's $137 billion that is spent annually in the United States to deal with invasive species. That's including plants and animals and also fish. Of that, 5.4 billion is related to invasive fish. And a lot of that dollars that is associated with that is it's tied to economic damages and also the cost to control those, particular invasive species. And nationwide, non-native fish species have been a contributing factor in 70% of the ESA fish listings. I know several of the listings, particularly with it being, bull trout, one of the potential listing factors of there had to do with non-native lake trout and also non-native eastern brook trout. Then you also start including other fish species such as smallmouth bass, walleye, northern pike. It is one of the contributing factors in a lot of the ESA fish listings. And to kind of give you a little bit more of some context of these, what seems like huge numbers, just from 2010 through 2017, the federal government and other agencies spent nearly $400 million on trying to prevent Asian carp to the Great Lakes. That's just in a span of 8 years. To give you some more context, in 2018, they had 10 million, in 2019, 25 million, and then 2022, 225 million. A lot of that had to do with a huge appropriation that the Army Corps of Engineers got to prevent Asian carp from moving to the Great Lakes. I know Blaine Parker brought this up a little bit earlier, some neat graphics that you can get through the U.S. Geological Survey. This is one that I did just a week or so ago. Gives you the number of introduced species within the United States, going from 1900 up until the present. So you can see in the present right now, we have 1,324 introduced species within the United States. Of that, within fishes, it's 596, plants is 246, and marine fish, it's 139. That's not individual species. So when you're looking at, it could be native to East Coast, but not native to the West Coast. That's how a lot of those numbers kind of get. It seems like that they're inflated, but what is native in one area is, can be an introduced or non-native species in another part, even within a basin. And here's kind of, I broke it down a little bit even further refined, is give you an idea of the number of groups that are introduced within the state of Washington. So roughly 37%, 67 species are fish and 66 are plants. That's just within the state of Washington. So between plants and fish, they make up, more than 70%. And here is also for Oregon and Idaho. And these are numbers I just generated off the USGS site last week. So in Oregon, you have 78 fish, 50 plants. In Idaho, you have 77 fish and 27 plants. So kind of gives you some context that when it comes to invasive species, fish are, the numbers are extremely high. And I think that a lot of emphasis has been put on plants or weeds, but fish species, how they get introduced, across, the continent is, very, very problematic. So one of the things I really kind of wanted to focus on is, kind of the impacts on, what this can mean to the tribes. And I've heard this, before by several, people giving presentations, is invasive species are not limited by jurisdictional boundaries. They have no boundaries whatsoever. And also kind of give you some other context is that federally recognized American Indian tribes are second only to the federal government when it comes to the amount of land that's managed. This was actually, it came from a white paper several years ago, kind of articulating, how tribes can really play a role and should be playing a role in terms of invasive species, particularly in dealing with those with their neighbors, which can be, could be the federal, could be other tribes, could be state, county governments as well. Private ownership is that, this is kind of a common, I don't know if you want to call it interest or potentially a common enemy amongst all the stakeholders, because there's a lot to lose that can happen with these invasive species. And effective coordination and cooperation across these jurisdictions is really important in the prevention and eradication of these invasive species. If you have one entity that is trying to control a particular insect or a fish, but adjacent to that could be a different state that may not recognize that as being invasive or problematic, that's where you can kind of run into these, these issues. And, I also heard the term, politicalness around that is making sure that there's a common theme in order to combat these. And, these are great concerns for, the previous presentation that Anthony gave was, the cultural, the subsistence, and also the economic resources, particularly for tribes. And you always kind of hear in the salmon and steelhead world of the 4-H's, which is habitat, hatcheries, harvest, and hydropower. And I'm here, and I've been preaching this for a long time, is that you also need to start including the letter I in that for invasive species. Because invasive species, have we, seen through many of these presentations, and we will only continue, are causing a huge impact on the resources that tribes are trying to manage for.
Joe, 4 minutes.
Okay, I am almost done. I'm cruising through. Here's just kind of give a little bit more context on the number of fish introductions throughout the Columbia Basin. Here's a map that Beth Sanderson had done, I don't know, probably 15 years ago. And I think there's another one that got updated by the independent scientific review panel that shows the number of they're called non-indigenous or non-native fishes within these basins. And a lot of them are really linked to where hydropower projects are. So when you have hydropower projects going in, an altered ecosystem, changing a river to a reservoir, making it get warm, it just, it really kind of, hinges toward non-native species and not so much for native species. And here's the invasion curve that hopefully most everybody has seen. But when you have this, an invasion happen, and this is what happened with northern pike, getting on it early and often, you're able to deal with it at this introduction detection level, and where, don't know if you can actually, eradicate in some instances, but you can mow the grass, as Blaine was saying earlier, as short as possible so that we're not, having those impacts go further downstream. And I think also when it kind of gets into this whole, fish issues is, when northern pike first came on the scene within the state of Washington and the Ponder River in our neck of the woods, it was the tribe was the one who was pushing towards, we need to manage against these things. At that particular time, the state of Washington fisheries managers were really advocating for, this is an opportunity for having a potentially trophy fishery, because the river's really been starved for a long time. It took quite a bit of education and pushing to the state Fish and Wildlife Agency that the right thing to do is to manage against these and not manage for them. So ultimately, we got the state of Washington convinced on that. And they are part and parcel with the tribe and other tribes within the state of Washington in managing against these. So I would claim that as a victory. But the other thing, when it also comes to these other fisheries, that I think that we're running into, issues with the state of Washington, or it could be other state and fish wildlife agencies, is they manage non-native sport fish, which could be walleye, smallmouth, channel catfish. They have a constituency that they're trying to, appease or manage for in terms of license sales. But I think it's pretty well documented that those non-native sport fish are having a severe impact on invasive species. So I think that that's something that particular tribes can start getting, playing a bigger role in also helping kind of shape how, non-native fish are managed against, into the future. So with that, if there's any questions, and hopefully I got done just in time, Maria.
Yes, you did great.